what is faith? What is the purpose of faith? Do we even need it? With Meister Eckhart, people have questioned whether faith is even necessary and whether Christianity is even a necessary part of his thought. Kind of an ironic thing for somebody who was a master of theology in the late 1200s and early 1300s, a time where surely he would have been and was, we hear now, an Orthodox Catholic. So this is a strange charge, but it arises not without reason. Eckhart's version of Christianity doesn't emphasize faith, at least in the sense that we're commonly familiar with now, in a kind of blind faith, one where you just accept things, and certainly not in the way of, credo quia absurdum, so in the way of I believe because it is absurd, that we hear from Tertullian. So this is encapsulated in two remarks that are well known in Eckhart circles. The first is from Emil Cioran in 1969, where he said, "What advantage would having faith be to me, since I understand Meister Eckhart just as well without it?" This is a serious charge. He's saying, look, what Eckhart had to say was very interesting, and it appeals to people, appeals to him, appeals to a lot of people today, but it's not specifically Christian. I think it behooves us to take this charge seriously and to question whether or not Eckhart really did need faith and what the purpose of faith is in Eckhart's system. And so I want to answer Cioran in the same way that I answer Schopenhauer. Schopenhauer had something similar to say, although he was writing considerably earlier. So in The World as Will and Representation, this is Book 3, Chapter 34, he says that the peculiarly Christian aspects of Eckhart's thought were an unfortunate addition, and that they're only an excrescence, which can be removed without in any way affecting the general character of his doctrine. Again, a serious charge. And so I want to take on both of these by introducing, or at least referring to, an idea in Eckhart's writings that is not often talked about very much. And that is rushing ahead. So when I describe Eckhart's take on faith in my book, Paradox at Play, I referred to faith as a kind of beauty. And of course, that's meant to be a kind of quotable remark, but it's also a strange sort of thing in the sense that it needs to be unpacked. What do I mean by faith being a kind of beauty? So ultimately, what I have in mind is the Platonic conception of beauty. And the Platonic conception of beauty was such that beauty is the vehicle to the divine for Plato. So beauty is the vehicle that carries you from the lower ontological rungs up to the higher ones. So we ascend in Plato's great chain of being by way of beauty. This is a strange thing, and it's not even talked about very much with respect to Platonic scholarship, but it's a key concept, and it's a key dynamic that is specifically rhetorical, and one might even say ministerial, in the sense that it plays specifically to people's motivations, how it is that they are inspired to get moving, to stay moving, and to get going in the right direction. And that's ultimately what I have in mind, and what Eckhart had in mind. He refers in several different of his sermons to the idea of rushing ahead, in saying that faith rushes ahead of knowledge. Faith rushes ahead of certainty. In other words, faith is something that you have when you don't know where to go. When you don't know which direction to head in, you can't know exactly where you're getting before you get there, and so you kind of have to start moving in some direction. Faith gives you the right direction to start moving in, and so you start moving in that direction, and then later on you find out for sure, you experience it for yourself. That's the key with Meister Eckhart. You experience it and you see it for yourself, and then you no longer need that kind of faith. Wait a minute. We've departed from the traditional story, right? We've departed from the story which says that you always need faith, that it's, an irreducible thing and that it will never go away. But for Eckhart was a mystic. And so there are a variety of passages in his work, and I discuss this at much greater length in the book, where it's easy to see that he's talking about experience. It's easy to see that he's talking about tasting of God and seeing it for yourself. He refers to, for instance, the wine that is kept in your cellar. And so, how does someone know if the wine in their cellar is any good if they haven't tasted it? They can talk about it, they can intellectualize about it, they can, address it in the abstract, etc., but that's all basically worthless compared to the experience of, no kidding, actually tasting it for the first time. Once you taste, you know, and no amount of intellectualization can touch that experience. It can't refer to it, and it can't unseat it. It can't undo it. Once you've seen for yourself, you can't unsee it. And that's the nature of mystical experience in general. That's the tenor of Eckhart's writing. It's entirely in a tight orbit around God and meant to get us to try, to enjoin us to try and figure out how to get that taste, how to experience God for yourself. And that experience, ultimately, the mystical experience, is one that he has in mind with respect to the purpose of faith. And so faith is not an end in itself. Faith is a kind of beauty. Beauty is a vehicle. In other words, it is not the end in itself, it is merely the vehicle that gets you there. And this is why I mentioned the Buddhist story of the parable of the raft. So in Buddhism, there's a common story that's told with respect to the rules of the order, the morality of the order, all of the different things that you have to learn, the hard practice and the long hours and the austerities and all of the scriptures and just all of the trappings of Buddhism, everything about it. And we're told that all of that is like the raft. You get on the raft and sail to where it is that you're going. And when you get to the other side, do you pick up the raft and put it on your back out of respect for the raft? That would be silly, right? There's no reason to do that. That was a vehicle to get you from one place to the other. It was not the end in itself. It is not the island that you're traveling to. It's just a vehicle to get you across the water. Such is the same we are to understand with everything else, basically. Anything that is not that mysticism, anything that is not that mystical experience is analogous to the raft. And indeed, Eckhart actually has something that is very similar to the parable of the raft in his writings. So this is how Eckhart understands faith, is as a rushing ahead. It is something that allows us to start moving in some direction when we otherwise have nowhere to go. Now, you might have heard the story of Buridan's donkey. And so sometimes this is called Buridan's ass. And so this is the story of a donkey that is set equidistant between two equally appetizing bales of hay. And we're told that there's no possible reason for the donkey to prefer one above the other. And so how does it choose? How can it tell which one that it should go to, because there's no motivation that would tip the scales and tell it to go to the left instead of the right? Well, it's very simple. If you're a donkey, you just start moving. But as people, this may stymie us, and we may be locked in stasis and not have any idea what to do and just kind of sit there and starve. And that's the story, right? That's the purpose of that story, is if we are presented with options that apparently look exactly the same, or we have no meaningful way of telling them apart, what do we do? How do we know how to even start moving? This comes from, and this is analogous to, what's called the Sophistic paradox, Meno's paradox in Plato. And it's called Meno's paradox because this comes up in the Meno, the dialogue, where the question is asked, how can you go searching for something unless you already know what it is? And if you already know what it is, you don't need to go searching for it. So how can you ask questions to try and come to know something unless you already know what it is? Otherwise, you can't even formulate the question. It's kind of a mind-scrambling sort of thing. But if you think about it, it's not a vacuous problem. It's the problem of not having already had the experience before you get there. How do you even know what direction to go in? I like to liken this to musical practice, to artistic practice, to sports practice. So in athletics, how do you learn how to do something? How do you learn to be a good quarterback? How do you learn to be a good painter or a good musician? How can you possibly know what to do if you haven't already gotten there? There are all kinds of different things that you can do. You could hold the pick in different ways. You can position your fingers and hands in different ways. You might be able to throw the ball in different ways. How do you know what to practice? How do you know what to do? How do you even know that the practice is going to be effective? And ultimately, as a beginner, you don't. Which is why you have to have a kind of faith in a teacher. This is the notion of faith that corresponds to what Eckhart has in mind, because that faith that you have in your teacher is a kind of confidence, which is why, and I'm emphasizing this because in Buddhism this is sraddha, and so sraddha is the closest that you get to faith in Buddhism. It is a confidence. You have a confidence in a teacher that is going to show you something, with the understanding that if you practice it, you're going to get better and you're going to see it for yourself. You're going to get there and experience it for yourself, and then you no longer need a kind of blind adherence or faith in the traditionally understood way in the West, because you've seen it. You've tasted of it yourself. You don't need that kind of faith anymore. But the faith is what's necessary to get you going to begin with, to say, you know what, you're the exercise instructor, you seem to know what's going on, I'm going to put my faith in you that you know what you're doing, and I'm going to do the exercises that you prescribe. And then lo and behold, weeks pass, and I start getting stronger. I feel better, and I'm getting better at, okay, well, I don't need the faith anymore. I can simply have confidence that this worked. I saw it for myself, and then any further development that you might recommend, I'm probably going to have a similar confidence in you, that you're going to be able to take me to that next level higher and higher. Until such time, of course, as I plateau and see that, well, I'm kind of gotten all that I can from this teacher, and so maybe it's time for me to move on. And that's what people have always done with teachers in yoga, going back thousands of years, in music, even now. You might plateau with a teacher and move on to an advanced teacher or to a concert level, whatever. This is the way that it's approached in learning anything. This is the analogous way that we could understand faith in Eckhart. Now, that may not be wholly satisfying if you were hoping for a defense of Tertullian-like faith. That's not what you get in Eckhart, which is why when Cioran approaches this, he says, why do I need faith? If I understand Eckhart, then I don't need faith. Well, in a certain respect, he's right. If you already understand it, you don't need the faith. On the other hand, if you don't understand it, then it might help that you have some faith that he knows what he's talking about, and maybe I should apply myself and try and understand what's going on. So one way of understanding this, especially for Cioran, is that he is a Nietzschean at heart. And so what he has in mind, and we get this in some of his other works, for instance, he says that a man needs a little madness, or else he never dares to cut the rope and be free. This is in The Trouble with Being Born on page 14. And that tells you this madness is a kind of impetus to action. It is a push to start moving and maybe even push against one's, chains and push against the constraints of the society, break free of this is Nietzsche's metamorphoses, right? So it's the camel carries them, the lion breaks free of them, and so once the lion has fought the dragon and defeated, thou shalt not in Zarathustra, then you break free and you can go about creating your own values and creating your own meaning. In other words, that is the sense of motion that we get in this essentially post-nihilistic world that Cioran inhabits, that Nietzsche had also recognized in the middle of the 19th century. But of course, Eckhart was not living in this world. This was not the problem for Eckhart. He was still living in a world of divine providence. But his mysticism is such that it is peculiarly compatible with and speaks to a lot of the needs that people have today. And so circling back around to the very beginning, why does this matter? Why did Cioran even see fit to address this? Why did Schopenhauer care anything about addressing this? Well, it's because Eckhart's mysticism does appeal to people and has increasingly appealed to people over the past, this is now almost 200 years that it's been translated for the first time. And so that's something that we should take note of, and that's why it is, I think, that it behooves us to try and understand Eckhart's notion of faith, because it is Christian, but at the same time, it's not what we expect Christianity to be. And so we could answer Cioran by saying that you have to have some direction to go. You have to have some motion to any kind of attainment, to be able to move, to have Buridan's donkey sort of situation, to be able to choose it all, to be able to start moving. You have to start moving. You have to get going. And so faith gives you that kind of initial push. And it is in that way, I think, that we can start to answer as well Schopenhauer's claim that the Christianity that was part of Eckhart's message was a burdensome excrescence. I don't think that quite works. It is possible for Eckhart to appeal to someone who otherwise doesn't have any particular ties to Christian theology, to Christianity, to Christian belief and practice and institutions. But at the same time, there is a resonance by virtue of the symbols and the images that are used that is preserved in Eckhart because they are classical Christian images and symbols, but they come to us without a lot of the things that people have trouble believing now. They have trouble believing in certain aspects of Christianity, and by and large, those aspects are precisely what's missing in Eckhart, or at least not emphasized in the same way that we get in other theologians. This, I think, explains a lot of why it is that Eckhart appeals to people today. And so all of this comes back full circle, and I hope you see, to Eckhart's notion of faith and why it is that I thought it was appropriate to describe Eckhart's faith as a kind of beauty, because beauty is ultimately what impels us to have motion of any kind. Beauty is at the root of desire, and desire is fundamentally what creates motion in our lives. Faith simply attempts to provide a productive end, a productive direction to that motion when otherwise we can't possibly know where to go before we've seen it for ourselves.